for the defendant who outsmarted the court. Judge Mitchell Carter thought this was going to be just another day in court. Another reckless teenager, another guilty plea, another case closed. But he was wrong, because today, the defendant wasn't just any kid. He was Eli Carter, 19 years old, facing serious charges of grand theft auto and resisting arrest. The kind of charges that could wreck a life before it even truly began. The air inside the Manhattan criminal court was thick, charged with tension. The gallery was packed, spectators whispering, waiting to see the inevitable. Because in their eyes, the case was already decided. But Eli Carter wasn't here to beg. He wasn't here to plead. He was here to fight. And before the judge could bring down the gavel, before the prosecution could claim their easy win, Eli was about to do something no one saw coming. He was about to outsmart the entire courtroom. The judge leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping lazily on the polished wood of his bench. He peered down at Eli over the rim of his glasses, his lips curling into something between a smirk and a warning. "You think you're some kind of legal expert?" His voice was dry, unimpressed. "This isn't a high school debate tournament, son." A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom. The bailiff, the stenographer, even the prosecutor cracked a grin. They had already decided how this would go. Eli didn't react. No nervous fidgeting. No pleading glances toward a public defender. He had spent years preparing for this, not this exact moment, of course, but this battlefield. While other kids memorized basketball stats, Eli memorized Supreme Court rulings. While his friends played video games, he played out entire trials in his head. Dissecting arguments, predicting counterpoints, this wasn't just a courtroom to him, it was a chessboard, and he was about to make his move. Eli Carter hadn't just stumbled into a courtroom. He had been raised in one. His mother, Angela Carter, had worked as a paralegal for over 20 years, and Eli had grown up on the stories she brought home: how prosecutors cut corners, how judges played favorites, how some defense attorneys barely lifted a finger for their clients. He learned more about the system at the dinner table than most law students did in a semester. By the time he was 14, he could break down a trial better than half the interns in his mother's office. But none of that mattered to Judge Carter. To him, Eli was just another kid who had made a bad decision. "Let's make this quick," the judge sighed, flipping open the case file. "I have a tea time at 2. A ripple of laughter spread through the courtroom. This time, though, something shifted. Eli's lips twitched into the faintest smirk, so small that most people wouldn't have noticed. But to him, this was the first crack in the prosecution's armor. Grayson had just made his first mistake. The prosecutor, Daniel Harrington, rose from his seat like a man who had already won. His suit was sharp, his tie perfectly symmetrical, and his voice carried that polished authority of someone who had recited this speech 100 times before. "Your Honor, the state will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the defendant, Eli Carter, was caught red-handed inside a stolen vehicle, a 2022 Tesla Model S, reported missing just hours before his arrest. Officers engaged in pursuit through downtown Manhattan, where the defendant allegedly attempted to evade capture before being taken into custody. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. The prosecution submits that the evidence speaks for itself." The words landed like a hammer. The gallery murmured. On the surface, it sounded damning: a stolen car, a chase, a suspect caught running. Judge Carter glanced at Eli over the rim of his glasses, then turned back to Harrington. "Go on." The prosecutor strode toward the jury box, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the marble floor. Eli watched him carefully. Because the man was walking straight into a trap. "The defense may try to convince you that this was all just a misunderstanding," Harrington said, pacing slowly. "That Mr. Carter is some unfortunate victim of circumstance." Then he turned, finally locking eyes with Eli. His next words were sharper. "But let's be honest, what kind of victim runs from the police?" The tension in the room thickened. Judge Carter leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand. Eli didn't blink. Harrington continued, flipping through a neatly stacked pile of documents. "Your Honor, I have here the sworn testimony of Officer Ryan Delgado, who personally witnessed the defendant behind the wheel before he attempted to flee. The vehicle was confirmed stolen. The arrest was by the book." Judge Carter exhaled through his nose, nodding. "Sounds straightforward to me, and for most people in the courtroom, it probably did. A stolen car, a chase, an arrest. It was an open and shut case. But Eli had spent too many years studying trials not to see the cracks in the foundation. He wasn't just listening, he was analyzing. Calculating. Still, he stayed silent, watching, waiting. Judge Carter tapped his gavel lightly. All right, let's hear from the defense. He turned to Eli's court-appointed attorney, a public defender named Rachel Monroe, who had barely said 3 words since stepping into the courtroom. She stood up, clearing her throat. Your Honor, my client. But before she could finish, Eli placed a hand on her arm, a silent request. She hesitated, then slowly sat back down. And for the first time, Eli Carter spoke. I'll be representing myself, Your Honor. The room went dead silent. Judge Carter's eyebrows lifted, clearly amused. Eli had their attention now. You'll what? Judge Carter's tone was laced with disbelief. Eli's voice remained calm, steady. I'll be defending myself. A murmur swept through the courtroom. The bailiff's eyebrows shot up. Harrington's smirk flickered just for a second before he let out a short, dismissive laugh. This should be interesting. But nobody was laughing when Eli took his first step forward, because everything was about to change. The weight of the courtroom settled around him as he adjusted his stance, hands still tucked casually in his pockets. He let the silence stretch just long enough to make them uncomfortable. Then, finally, he spoke. Your Honor, before I begin, I'd like to clarify something with the prosecution. Harrington arched an eyebrow, crossing his arms. Go ahead. Eli took a slow, deliberate step forward. You said Officer Ryan Delgado personally saw me behind the wheel before I was arrested, correct? Harrington exhaled sharply, already bored. That's right, and that testimony is written in his official report. Of course it is. Eli nodded, then turned to Judge Carter. Your Honor, I move to dismiss that testimony as evidence. Judge Carter narrowed his eyes. On what grounds? For the first time, Eli pulled his hands from his pockets, gesturing toward the prosecution's table. Because Officer Delgado never saw me in that car. In fact, he wasn't even on duty when the chase began. A flicker of confusion crossed Harrington's face. What are you talking about? Eli took another step forward. The game had just changed. Your Honor, if the court allows me, Eli said smoothly, I'd like to submit a request to verify Officer Delgado's GPS logs from that night. He let the words settle for a moment before continuing. If his report states that he personally witnessed me in the vehicle, then his location history should back that up. But he let the word hang in the air, stretching the tension just enough. I have a feeling it won't. A wave of murmurs rippled through the gallery. Judge Carter's frown deepened as he shifted his gaze toward Harrington. The prosecutor cleared his throat, his jaw tightening. That report was filed by an officer of the law, Your Honor. Are we really going to take the word of a defendant over a trained professional? Eli gave a small, almost casual shrug. If the officer was where he claimed to be, then the GPS data will prove it. But if he wasn't, he let the sentence trail off, letting them fill in the blanks themselves. Judge Carter studied him carefully, then turned back to the prosecution. Does the state have any objections to verifying the officer's GPS logs? Harrington hesitated. It was just a second too long. The jury noticed. The gallery noticed. And most importantly, the judge noticed. Eli took a slow, steady breath. He had spent years watching prosecutors, studying their tactics, the way they played the system. And there was one thing he knew for certain. If Harrington had complete confidence in his case, he wouldn't be stalling. Judge Carter sighed, rubbing his temple. Counselor Harrington's grip tightened around his pen. Finally, he shook his head. No objections, Your Honor. But it was too late. The shift had already begun. For the first time, nobody in the courtroom was laughing. Nobody smirked. Nobody whispered. The weight of uncertainty was settling in, thick and inescapable. Harrington shuffled his papers, his once polished confidence beginning to fray around the edges. Your Honor, he said quickly, reaching for solid ground. While we wait for the GPS records, the fact remains that the defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle. But Eli could hear it now. The doubt in his voice, and so could everyone else. Eli gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. That's true. Then, he took a step forward. But let's talk about that evidence for a second. Judge Carter raised an eyebrow, motioning for him to continue. Eli turned to the jury, scanning their faces, locking eyes with each of them one by one. The prosecution wants you to believe that finding my fingerprints in a car means I stole it. That's the story they're selling. He paused, letting the words settle before continuing, his voice steady, controlled. But let's think about this logically. He took a breath, keeping his tone measured. Let's say you walk into a department store and try on a jacket. You put your hands in the pockets, maybe zip it up, then place it back on the rack and walk out. A few hours later, someone steals that jacket. Would the fact that your fingerprints are on it mean you stole it? A few jurors exchanged uncertain glances. A murmur spread through the gallery. Eli didn't give them time to recover. The car in question was parked outside a 7-Eleven hours before the alleged theft. I was inside that store with 3 friends. And yes, when we walked past the car, I leaned against it. I even opened the door because it was already unlocked. He shrugged, as if it were nothing, because to him it was. I didn't think much of it. Didn't take the car. Didn't drive it. Didn't steal anything from inside. Just a dumb moment of curiosity. He let that sit, let them process it. Then, in a voice so precise, so sharp, it sliced through the silence like a scalpel, he asked, "Does touching something make you a criminal?" The room felt like it had stopped breathing. Harrington cleared his throat, flipping through his notes, searching for anything to regain control. But he wouldn't find it, because Eli had just turned the case on its head. But Eli wasn't finished, and while we're on the topic, he said smoothly, turning to Judge Carter. Let's talk about how that fingerprint analysis was done. The judge squinted slightly. Go on. Eli turned fully now, his posture relaxed but his words anything but. Your Honor, was the forensic specialist from this case subpoenaed to testify? Judge Carter blinked, momentarily caught off guard. He glanced at Harrington, who shifted uncomfortably. The prosecutor hesitated, then muttered, no. Eli pressed his lips together, as if that was exactly what he expected. So let me get this straight, he said, voice calm but deliberate. The state is using forensic evidence to try and convict me, but they didn't think it was necessary to bring in the actual specialist who processed that evidence. No chance for me to cross-examine, no way to question the chain of custody. No opportunity to challenge the accuracy of the analysis. Harrington's jaw clenched. Eli nodded once, a simple knowing gesture. Interesting. Judge Carter let out a slow sigh, pinching the bridge of his nose. It was the look of a man realizing this case was not the easy win he had assumed it would be. But Eli wasn't done yet, because what he was about to say next would change everything. He took a slow step forward, his voice steady but firm. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence an official statement from the owner of the vehicle. Judge Carter frowned. The owner? Eli nodded. Yes, Mr. Raymond Whitaker, the registered owner of the so-called stolen Tesla, provided a statement to the police that for some reason was never submitted in the prosecution's filings. He turned to Harrington now, his expression sharp. And I think I know why. A hush fell over the courtroom. Eli let the moment stretch, then tilted his head slightly. Tell me, counselor, do you recall what Mr. Whitaker told officers the night his car was reported stolen? Harrington's grip on his pen tightened, because now he was the one on the defensive. Harrington's jaw clenched. He knew exactly what was coming, but Eli didn't wait for him to answer. Instead, he reached into his file, pulled out a printed transcript, and read aloud. I left my car running when I ran inside the gas station. Some kid must have jumped in and taken off. But it wasn't the guy you arrested. I saw the kid, and he was white. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Eli held up the paper for everyone to see. That's from the original police report. The same report the prosecution conveniently never mentioned. Then, he turned back to Judge Carter. The arresting officer omitted this from his testimony. The prosecution ignored it. And yet, they expect this jury to believe that I, someone who doesn't even match the description of the real thief, am guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Harrington stepped forward, scrambling. Your Honor, this is irrelevant. The defendant was caught in possession of the vehicle. But Eli shook his head. No, I wasn't. His voice didn't rise, but it cut through the room like a scalpel. I was arrested blocks away from where the vehicle was abandoned, walking home after grabbing snacks with my friends. I wasn't in the car. I wasn't near the car. He paused, then delivered the final blow. I wasn't running from anything. The only thing tying me to this case is bad police work and assumptions. Judge Carter let out a slow breath, rubbing his temple. The case was unraveling fast and everyone knew it. Eli turned back to the jury, his voice firm but measured. The real suspect got away that night. The officers found a black kid in the same general area and decided that was close enough. He let the words hang in the air. Silence. Not the kind of silence that comes from a lull in conversation, but the kind that happens right before everything changes. Judge Carter cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. Does the prosecution have anything further? Harrington was frozen. His shoulders were stiff, his face flushed. He had nothing left. No, Your Honor. Judge Carter exhaled. The weight of the trial hung in the air. He looked at Eli, studying him. Then his gaze drifted to the jury, a jury that no longer had any doubt. Finally, he leaned forward and spoke the words that would stay with everyone in that room. Case dismissed. A beat of stunned silence. Then half the courtroom erupted, some in disbelief, others in quiet relief. The gallery stirred. Reporters scribbled in their notebooks, but Eli didn't move right away. He let the moment settle. Let the reality sink in for everyone. Judge Carter, still gripping his gavel, watched him carefully, and in his eyes, there was something new, recognition. Maybe even regret. Eli met his gaze, then turned to leave, but just as he reached the door, the judge spoke again. Mr. Carter. Eli stopped, but he didn't turn. Judge Carter hesitated. Then, finally, he said, "You should consider law school." Eli smirked. He didn't need to consider it. He was already on his way. Outside the courthouse, the air was thick with voices. Reporters swarmed the steps, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward like weapons. Eli, did you know the judge would dismiss the case? What are you going to do next? How does it feel to outmaneuver a seasoned prosecutor? Eli pulled his hoodie over his head, ignoring them all. This wasn't about proving how smart he was. This was about something bigger. And at the bottom of the courthouse steps, his mother was waiting. Angela Carter stood there, arms crossed, face unreadable. For a long moment, she just looked at him. Then, finally, she let out a breath. And that was all Eli needed. "Boy, you scared me half to death." Angela Carter let out a breath, shaking her head. Eli chuckled, scratching the back of his head. "Had to take a risk, Ma." She stared at him a second longer, then pulled him into a tight hug. "You always were the stubborn one." The cameras kept flashing, reporters still shouting questions. But Eli wasn't paying attention anymore, because across the street, standing by his car, Judge Carter was watching, and something was different. His posture had changed. The arrogance was gone. His expression wasn't amused anymore. It was something else, something closer to reflection. He hadn't expected this case to be anything more than routine. Just another day, another defendant, another guilty plea. But now, he knew he'd remember this one, because Eli Carter had done something most people never could. He made the system look at itself, and for once it blinked first. How many times has this happened before? How many people have been convicted not because of solid evidence, but because of bias, shortcuts, and a system that values closing cases over uncovering the truth? Eli had the knowledge to fight back, but what about the ones who don't? Because this wasn't just about one case, it was about all of them. And Eli knew exactly what he had to do next. This courtroom wouldn't be the last one he stood in, but next time he wouldn't be the defendant. He'd be the attorney, and when that day came he wouldn't be alone. If this story made you stop and think even for a second, share it. Because the justice system is built on laws, but it's run by people. And people can change. But only if we make them. Hit that like button. Subscribe for more stories that matter. Join the conversation, because next time, it might not be Eli, it might be someone you know.